gave us interesting insights on the intricacies of elections and democracy and how COVID-19 has affected not only the conduct of elections in Africa, but also the relationships in the political landscape. COVID-19 necessitated stakeholders to take critical decisions on whether to hold, postpone, or cancel elections. And from the case studies that we canvassed yesterday from South Africa to Malawi to Burundi, we've seen that this has led to various consequences on the democratic path of these countries. Interestingly, we saw that Malawi and Burundi, they held momentous elections in their countries, being presidential elections, and stakeholders needed to address questions around electoral preparedness and voter engagement amidst a pandemic. And on top of these questions, this was on top of other questions that plague African elections around the credibility, the free and fairness of our elections. And from these countries, we have been able to draw lessons on both the good and the bad from the experiences of these countries. We saw various themes emerge from these presentations, including voter turnout amidst a pandemic. In Burundi, we saw that actually the turnout turned out to be quite high despite the pandemic, but we know Burundi held the elections at the beginning of the pandemic when we were still trying to understand COVID-19, and it led to a certain result that, looking at Burundi and how it was, and also Malawi, which had a momentous landmark election that followed the decision that annulled the presidential election results last year, and they still had a turnout which was considerable considering that it was amid a pandemic. But interestingly, in Malawi, we saw that the voter turnout was reduced as compared to the initial election in 2019, but COVID could have an effect on this. And I think based on the presentation, we could see that there's still room for more engagement and research on how COVID has affected elections in Africa in 2020. And I believe this conference, just as we've started, is a good, not starting point because these conversations are ongoing, but another way to continue the discussion around elections and democracy in Africa during the pandemic year and even beyond. Other themes that emerged yesterday included accessibility and the role of election observers, particularly in 2020, because given the movement restrictions, a lot of these elections were not able to be observed by international observers, and it has raised certain questions around the credibility of these elections. Another theme that emerged was local government politics and how these intricacies are working in this space. And while these are conversations that have happened and are ongoing in Africa's political landscape, we see that in the wake of the pandemic, it has given a new spin in these conversations, and we continue to engage in this today. Today's theme is largely on technology, media, and elections, with case studies from South Africa, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. We have 3 presenters for the first session in the morning and 2 presenters for the afternoon session, which will be a bit shorter. And just to bring to your attention, there's a slight change in the lineup of presenters. For the morning session, Paul Mudau will be making his presentation, and Ivan Mugabe, we have shifted him to the afternoon slot at his request. Beyond just that, just housekeeping, everyone please ensure your microphones are off to avoid disruptions. You can post questions to the chat box. Unless you really want to speak, you can use the raise the hand function in your Zoom. I think it's at the bottom of the screen, and please ensure you keep all the videos off unless you're presenting, because you see that helps with combating network challenges. The conference will be recorded, and it is currently being live streamed on Facebook and our YouTube channel for the Center for Human Rights. You can visit this page even afterwards, where the recordings will be available not only for this webinar, but our previous webinars. It is now my honor to introduce our moderator for the session, Deya. He's a very common name in this space, not only in Kenya, his mother country, but Tanzania, I think, which is his adopted country right now, and in Africa at large. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Among other things, he chairs the executive committees of the Pan-African Citizens Network, the International Coalition of the Responsibility to Protect, and the Financial Transparency Coalition. He's a current steering committee member and former chair of the African Court Coalition, and is also a former secretary of the African Forum of the International Bar Association. He's also a former member of the executive committee of the International Institute of Law Association Chief Executives. And we even had to shorten down his profile. It's quite a long one. Over to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Marystella. And at least in the time in which you're giving us an introduction and a summary to yesterday, our numbers have increased from 36 to 47. I'm very happy about that. I'm sure they'll continue increasing as we go along. So colleagues, just yesterday, in the context of something else that I was doing, I ended up looking again at the guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And that's an endeavor in which the Center for Human Rights at Pretoria hosted and contributed to significantly. So I would like to start by taking a moment to just celebrate the Center for Human Rights at the School of Law at the University of Pretoria, and to express our gratitude for the leadership and partnership that the center provides on matters of human and people's rights and on democracy, good governance, the rule of law, regional integration, and continental unity generally. I acknowledge the unique institutional identity and platform of the center, being at the same time an academic institution and also a think tank, and also a proactive non-governmental organization or non-state actor, and therefore it is able to engage with a whole range of governmental, intergovernmental, and non-governmental actors. So I appreciate the intervention that they're taking at this time when we're looking at elections in Africa, contested in the best of times, and really precarious in the context of COVID-19. I mean, just to mention a few examples, we're looking at Cote d'Ivoire in the last 2 weeks, we're looking at Guinea, we're looking at Tanzania in the last 2 weeks. And of course, for a lot of Africans, we're also looking at the United States of America, which for very long, characterized itself as the world's greatest democracy, and it's all the scales are falling off our eyes for those who still have hard scales in their eyes and so on. And we realize that the work that we need to do across the world is bigger. In the context of COVID-19 and elections, PALU and a couple of our friends filed a request for an advisory opinion at the African Court on Human and People's Rights and asked them to interpret for Africa, for the African people, and for our governments and intergovernmental bodies, Article 13 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the right to effectively participate in the governance of our countries. So the deliberations we had yesterday and today will enrich these processes, and we hope that the court will issue a comprehensive advisory opinion in good time so it can help states decide whether to hold elections, and if they decide to hold them, when and how, and even if there's to be a decision to be made not to hold them, that decision be participatory and inclusive and is made by the people of a country and not just by the incumbent regime or even by the political parties only. So to lead us in this morning's session, we've got 3 eminent panelists, and those are Ms. Marystella Simiyu, who's just spoken, Mr. Paul Mudau, and Mr. Kudakwashe Bandama. And in order to save us time, I'll read the brief profiles out right now, so that thereafter, when we begin listening to them, we listen in a sort of unbroken manner. Marystella is a Doctor of Laws candidate at the University of Pretoria. She holds a master's from the same university, Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, cum laude. Prior to this, she got her Bachelor of Laws from Kenyatta University School of Law in Kenya. She's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She currently works as a programs officer at the Expression, Information, and Digital Rights Unit of the Center for Human Rights, Pretoria. Her research areas include democratization in Africa, international human rights law, constitutional law, elections and democracy, digital rights, and transitional justice. Marystella will speak to us about access to information during African elections, the disinformation threat. Immediately after her will be Mr. Paul Mudau. Paul is a PhD candidate and a researcher at the School of Law at the University of the Witwatersrand. He holds an LLB, a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Limpopo, a Master of Laws in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria, and a second LLM, a second Master's in Law, State, and Multi-Level Government from the University of the Western Cape. He's a former Municipal Outreach Coordinator and the head of Civic and Voter Education for South Africa's Independent Electoral Commission at the Musina local municipality in Limpopo. His research interests and areas include human rights, democracy, constitutionalism, local government law, and public administration. Paul will be speaking to us on civic and voter education, the potential of technological systems in promoting voter education during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. And then coming in third, as a third panelist, will be Mr. Kudwakwashe Bandama. Kuda is the principal strategist at the Youth and Democracy Incubator, which is a youth-driven non-profit organization that champions youth development and involvement in democracy processes. He has been involved in election work, both as an observer and as a technical assistant with a range of institutions, with the African Union, with the East African Community, and with ISA, the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. And this has covered both general elections and local government elections within the continent. He's a governance enthusiast and continues to advocate for good governance in practice and principle with deliberate youth inclusion, which I appreciate very much. So then coming on first, without much further ado, let's listen to Marystella Simiyu, who will speak to us on access to information during African elections, the disinformation threat. You have a maximum of 20 minutes, Marystella.
All right, thank you very much, Don, for that. Let me just share my screen. Please let me know when you see it. Is that fine?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We can see it.
All right, so my presentation today is on access to information during African elections, the disinformation threat. The structure of my presentation, I will first give the legal framework for access to information and freedom of expression, a conceptual framework for the second part of my title. I will then discuss best practices, the worst practices, and finally recommend the strategies. So it's very difficult to speak about access to information and not talk about freedom of speech. We know that these rights are protected under international law in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also the ICCPR. It's interesting that the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights also makes mention of this and does provide for the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And we are quite aware that digital technologies has revolutionized how we do exercise access to information and freedom of expression. Looking at the African human rights system, we see that these rights are also protected under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and it's also recognized in the objectives of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. We applaud the African Commission, which has taken steps to develop soft law instruments to protect these rights in the digital age. We see the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa that was revised in 2019 provides for the protection of these rights to freedom of expression and access to information online. The declaration does call on states to protect freedom of expression and access to information from interference, both online and offline. And part 3 and part 4 of this declaration is actually very informative because it continues to provide on how these rights can be protected in the internet space. It's also telling that it provides for the principle of non-interference that requires states, it provides a negative obligations of states to ensure that they do not interfere with the right of individuals to seek, receive, and impart information through ICT and digital technologies by such means such as removal, blocking, filtering of content, unless this is justified under international law and standards. The principle of non-interference also prohibits states from engaging or condoning in disruption of access to the internet, and also prohibits states from adopting economic measures such as taxes that will undermine the principle of universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet, unless this is justified under international law and standards. And the declaration goes further to provide for the role of internet intermediaries in this regard to ensure that the exercise of these rights in this space is not interfered with. The African Commission also came up with the guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, which Dawn made mention to, but I will particularly flag and spotlight the section that also provides that media and internet regulatory bodies shall refrain from shutting down the internet or any other form of media during an election. And we have seen that this is something that has become very rampant in Africa's electoral landscape, that during elections, we see increased incidences of internet shutdowns. The guidelines continue to say that internet shutdown should only be permissible under international law, and it makes reference to the three-part test of limitations of human rights, which is 1, authorized by law, to serve a legitimate aim, and be necessary and proportional in a democratic society. It further adds that any decisions regarding internet shutdowns should be subject to judicial review. But I personally think that the inclusion of these caveats or clawback clause, I feel it is against it's against ensuring we stop internet shutdowns in Africa, because it's already a problem as it is, and providing this small window that allows for internet shutdowns under certain conditions can be misused by electoral authoritarian governments in Africa. I will move to the second part of my title, which is on managing the disinformation threat. And I first thought to give a sort of conceptual framework around this. We can say that misinformation, for example, which is one of the lexicons around information disorder, is the unintentional sharing of false news that is not intended to cause harm. Disinformation is another concept that talks about the intentional dissemination of false information with the intention to cause harm. Both misinformation and disinformation do have implications on free speech and how we access information in this space. Something is happening with Chela Gloria. I don't know if Sempiwe, you can help me. She's writing on the screen. I'll continue. Both misinformation, as I was saying, disinformation, I will focus on disinformation because it's especially concerning, because it often preys on the differences in society, be it our political affiliations, our nationalities, our ethnicities and religions, and it seeks to amplify these differences in society. And what this does is that it distorts our public decision-making process as well as public debate. And in the context of election, it affects the decisions made by voters as well as stakeholders. For example, decisions, or if there's misinformation on how and where to vote, as well as information that incites electoral violence. These are issues, if it regards disinformation around this space, it can actually affect how voters engage in the electoral process. So is this a problem for us? Is disinformation a problem for us in Africa? We know in Africa, we already have limited technological capacity in many African countries. 1 minute. In Africa, we already know that we have limited technological capacity as compared to other continents. The internet penetration rate in Africa is 47.1%, and we are lagging behind other continents in the world. And beyond that, we see that men are more active in this space as compared to female. But is this an issue that we should be concerned about as Africans? Research has shown that people have admitted to having shared news that turned out to be false eventually. So in Kenya, this research identified that 38% of Kenyans, 35% of South Africans, as well as 28% of Nigerians had acknowledged that at some point they had shared information that eventually turned out to be false. How do we then address this problem of disinformation, having acknowledged that it is a problem in Africa? We see that disinformation is a complex issue, and it requires a deep understanding of the complexities of technology, media, and human behaviors, and how these three aspects interplay. And it requires a multi-stakeholder process with the input of both the public and private sector, civil society, media and internet regulators, as well as EMBs and just ordinary citizens. While we know that most false news is just spread by you and me, ordinary citizens, in the course of our interactions in the internet space, but when it's done by influential persons such as leaders and the social media influencers, because they have access to a wider audience, then it spreads to all these people and gets more reach and more engagement. So what best practices can we adopt to manage disinformation? Media and information literacy is one of these best practices that have been identified. The goal here is to empower citizens to critically evaluate the content in media sources, and in doing so, make informed decisions, not only as consumers of information in the net, but also as producers of this information. As a concept, it has been seen to work because the goal here is to develop an informed and critical citizenry as well as the electorate. But in practice, we have seen that it has led to various results. On one hand, it has increased the responsibility of how people consume and share news. But on the downside, media literacy has also been counterproductive because already research shows that people already see themselves as critical thinkers who are challenging the status quo. And when sometimes you're confronted with other views and opinions that are contrary to what you believe in, people tend to sometimes stick more strongly to what they believe in. And because of this, they let their decisions be guided by emotions and social dynamics. What does my ethnicity say? What does my tribe say? What does my nationality require me to ascribe to, or class and religion? All these guide as opposed to the facts that they're exposed to. And what this has led to is that increasingly we see that false news spreads faster than even the truth. Another best practice I saw was in South Africa, which last year during the elections had a platform called the Real 411, which was a platform that allowed citizens to report digital disinformation during the elections. These reports were directed to the election management bodies, Directorate for Electoral Offences, which took necessary action afterwards. The complaints were governed by the Electoral Code of Conduct, and they could be received in South Africa's 11 official languages, though the operating language of the Directorate is English. They require the complaints not to be, the complainants were not had to reveal themselves. They could not submit anonymous complaints, but their confidentiality was actually assured in this process. The complaints were considered by a panel of experts in media, law, and technology, and they made further recommendations to the commission, and certain actions that could be taken included criminal civil action, requesting social media companies to take down the information, or issuing media statements to counter those information and actually give out accurate information to the public. And in the wake of, after 2019, after the success of this platform, they scaled up operations so that they also received complaints about hate speech, about incitement, harassment of journalists, as well as COVID-19, which are now issues that will affect electoral discussion in this space, especially given that they're going to have the local government elections next year. Another best practice that I identified is fact-checking. In Africa, we have a number of fact-checking organizations. There's Africa Check, which is quite big and has offices in Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa. But the other countries, individual countries, do have fact-checking organizations that focus on fact-checking information online, or that they have seen reports in the media that require fact-checking. It would be remiss for me to talk about this without talking about the role of social media companies. Initially, they were reluctant to address information disorder in their platforms because it went against their capitalistic model. Because we know people are more likely to click on sensational information and inaccurate content as compared to the truth. And because of this, it attracts more traffic on the social media platforms and in turn attracts advertisers. But in 2016, following the US elections, the previous US elections and Brexit, platforms came under a lot of criticism for how they dealt with this. And they thought they have seen that there's actually a real threat that disinformation poses to democracy. And since then, social media companies have been trying to manage disinformation in their space. And in the context of a health crisis, we see that it poses a real threat, not only now to democracy if elections are happening in the context of a pandemic, but also people's lives. And we have actually noticed that social media companies are more tough on health misinformation in their platforms as compared to how they previously dealt with political misinformation in their platforms. And they do adopt certain strategies, such as using fact-checking by the users, you and me, when we're on these platforms. You can flag information that is false. They also use third-party fact checkers as well as AI technology, and they label political ads as such so that people are aware of this. Moving on to worst practices, internet shutdowns is one such practice that we have seen that certain states are using to combat disinformation. And we have seen there's a link between elections and internet shutdowns in electoral authoritarian regimes. They do justify these actions by saying to address national security concerns and fears around spreading of fake election results. But in truth, internet shutdowns are implemented so as to ensure that the public or people who are in polling stations and have access to this information do not report electoral malfeasance or mobilize in terms of protests if people are dissatisfied with the elections. And already in 2020, we have seen reports of internet shutdowns in Burundi, Togo, and most recently in Tanzania, which is very concerning as a way that we see that states are adopting to manage information during elections. And the thing with internet shutdowns is that most governments cannot directly restrict internet access, but they have to, get into agreements with the internet service providers to stop their services. In countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, the government controls 100% of the internet infrastructure. So this is easy for them. They can easily shut down the internet when they feel the need requires. But in other countries which have a more diversified landscape when it comes to internet provision, like Nigeria, South Africa, and Uganda, this requires the internet service providers to actually agree to this. And sometimes it's in the wording of their licensing agreements. But also now this brings in the importance of why internet service providers are very necessary in conversations about human rights and how their actions can impact on human rights. Because at the end of the day, this goes against the principles of open, secure, and accessible internet. Another strategy that we have seen, which is a worst practice, is the criminalization of false news. The Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit of the Center for Human Rights, which is where I'm based, did do a research on which we call the disinformation tracker. We came up with a disinformation tracker that looked at the responses by governments to disinformations. And we saw that the challenge of this is that a lot of the strategies that governments have adopted lean more towards criminalization of false news. Many countries have already enacted laws to address disinformation, and a lot of them threaten the enjoyment of freedom of expression and access to information in this space. I will do a case study. I thought to look at Tanzania with the recent elections that happened on 28th October 2020, where we saw increased reports of infringement of freedom of expression, access to information, and internet and media freedom ahead of the elections. Before the elections, the state had already issued a directive to limit bulk state text messaging. Social media platforms such as Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram had been blocked. And there were reports of intimidation, harassment, arbitrary arrest of political opponents, journalists, as well as human rights defenders. And one of the main opponents, his campaign was suspended earlier that month because he supposedly used seditious languages. On top of that, Tanzania has draconian media laws. While there's no specific disinformation law, we have a number of media laws that have implications on how people exercise freedom of speech as well as access information in Tanzania. And a lot of these laws raise concerns from a human rights perspective because they are vaguely worded that can be broadly interpreted and misused by enforcement agencies. And a lot of these laws and the limitations in them do not meet the legitimate aims of international law and are not justifiable in a democratic society. Some of the practices we saw that, and I think you've had this, international press had a very difficult time looking at elections in Tanzania because there was a law that prevented international press from covering developments in the country without local media partnerships. And there was also reports of governments silencing criticism from not only media, but other people online and both offline. We saw that certain media houses and journalists faced sanctions because of this. There was a journalist who had his license suspended because he reported on a COVID-19 patient. Another online newspaper had their license suspended because they reported on an incident where Magufuli was at the market surrounded by people, and the government said they were spreading false news because they were trying to have a conversation about the government response to COVID-19. And I do know that was it in June that Tanzania did declare Tanzania COVID-free. So such conversations went contrary to that rhetoric and that narrative that the government was pushing. And we saw other media houses getting sanctions because of reports around country approach to government, to how the government was handling coronavirus, as well as stories around electoral reform also led to sanctions for certain media houses. And this really shows that the quality, the state of media freedom, the state of internet freedom in Tanzania is actually on a very worrying trajectory decline. not only in the electoral space, but this began way before the election started. And internet shutdowns are very worrying in the context of a pandemic, because we actually need timely and accurate information, not only about the elections, but health updates, about movement restrictions and relevant news to protect ourselves. Internet shutdowns also have economic implications. And in this space, we are also saying that it allows for rumors to breed, because people do not have access to accurate information. And so they're coming up with ways to, to justify what they think is happening. And where we are dealing with a besieged media, when in the absence of a robust and independent media, it does give a ground for rumors to breed. And in some contexts, it can lead to escalated violence and tensions. While governments use it to say, like, let's stop protests and let's stop violence by shutting down the internet, in some certain incidences, such as Egypt, it actually led to increased tensions and violence when the internet was shut down. In conclusion, I will look to the strategies that we can use to manage disinformation while still ensuring we exercise access to information, our right to access to information and freedom of speech. And some of the responses, we need to actually, the goal here is to protect our election integrity in the face of disinformation. We need to, as stakeholders, anticipate electoral disinformation, what impact it will have on our elections, and see how to combat these. We know in the context of elections, conspiracy theories about candidates, about political parties, about the whole process, about election results and the EMB's operation are a real threat in the context of an election. And another issue that is concerning is how certain politicians label real news or credible news as fake news, which was at first popularized by like Donald Trump. He's very good at labeling news that he does not like, that feel is criticizing him as fake news. And this has been picked up by a lot of authoritarian regimes. And after that, we as stakeholders need to identify and coordinate the relevant actors and see how they can play a role in managing disinformation during elections. This includes regulators, of course, CSO, media platforms, political actors, and voters who cannot be excluded in this process. And media and information literacy should be integrated into civic and voter education by the election management bodies and CSOs, and ensure that they direct voters and the general public to credible sources of electoral information. I believe the Real 411 by South Africa is something other countries can learn from and adopt their own platforms. This was a brainchild of a civil society organization, Media Monitor in Africa, and the election management body. So it just helps to show how stakeholders can work together in managing such threats to disinformation and election integrity. I also believe as stakeholders, we need to push back against draconian media laws and internet shutdowns by electoral authoritarian governments, and also rope in internet service providers who need to push back and ensure transparency in the operation. If they receive any government requests that raise human rights concerns, this should be transparently reported to people, and they should push back to requests that raise human rights concerns. I think I'm just going to end my presentation there. I believe I'm within the time limit. Thank you very much. Over to you, Don.
Actually, you went only 1 minute above time, so we will concede that. Thank you very much, Marystella, especially for highlighting towards the end some suggestions of what proactive citizens should do. In 2018, Nick Cheeseman and Brian Klaas wrote a book, How to Rig an Election in Africa. And maybe in asking us to be proactive, I haven't read the book, I hope to get time to read it soon, but maybe in asking us to be proactive, we'll ask ourselves, we now know the rule book that many African governments use in the run-up to an election, during the electoral cycle, and immediately thereafter. So how can we be proactive about that? While we think about that, let me welcome Paul Mudau, who will speak to us about civic and voter education and the potential for technological systems in promoting voter education during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. So welcome, Paul, and you have a maximum of 20 minutes. Thank you.
I would like to share my screen. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
It says that host disabled participant screening.
Okay, maybe the hosts can look at that. Maybe they did that earlier.
Let me just check with Zimpiwe. 1 minute.
Yes, please. So that we don't lose a lot of time, Paul, are you able to at least start while they try to fix that? Just start.
Try again, sir.
I mean, I could, in the time being,
I
proceed with the presentation.
Yes, but try one more time to share the screen. If it doesn't work, then just proceed without the shared screen as we see how to work that out. Yes, it looks like it's working now. Yes, it is working.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
perfect.
You. Yeah. The topic of my presentation is civic and voter education, the potential of technological systems in promoting voter education during COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. So the CVE, which is an abbreviation of civic and voter education, is designed to provide citizens with communication, general and communication skills to constructively participate in the democratic electoral processes. It is meant to ensure the readiness, willingness, and ability of voters in participating in electoral activities. However, in most cases, you find that there are insufficient programs which are both directly and indirectly associated with poor voter turnout, voter registration, lack of understanding of voter procedures, underage voting, and election violence. There is a conviction that the greater the attendance in civic and voter education events, the greater the conviction that a significant number of participants has been enlightened and encouraged to fully participate in the electoral processes. However, with the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, the physical training session and information dissemination events where participants or the target groups who need voter and civic education, they become impacted because there has to be a restricted number of people who will be attending such events, or completely gatherings are banned, like we have observed across Africa, where the regulations which have been imposed by the government do not allow people to gather in groups. As a result, the election management bodies, which are often charged with the responsibility to promote or conduct voter education, they face numerous challenges. The four main objectives of civic and voter education are to promote a culture of democracy and human rights by creating and emphasizing the awareness of civic responsibilities, to increase knowledge and understanding of the electoral processes, to empower target groups and areas where voter turnout has been historically low, so that they could participate fully in the electoral processes, and to capacitate the electorate to participate in the voting process, resulting in the decrease of the number of spoiled or invalid votes. In most cases, the target groups for the civic and voter education are women, youth, persons with disabilities, the electorate, the voters in rural areas, marginalized and disadvantaged minorities. The election management bodies are often mandated by legislation and the constitution so that they could conduct CVE, civic and voter education. However, these kind of programs which they need to Sorry, I think there is someone who's typing something on the screen. Okay, thank you. The civic and voter education must be conducted in a non-partisan manner where the programs do not favor a particular candidate or a political party. In doing so, the election management body, they can also collaborate with civic organizations. There is a growing trend of constitutionalization and legislation in Africa of civic and voter education. Some of the constitutions which provide for civic and voter education are listed in here. And for instance, in South Africa, the constitution does not provide a clear-cut mandate on the election management body to conduct voter education, but it is legislation, which is the Electoral Commission, that requires the Electoral Commission to conduct civic and voter education. There are countries which the election management bodies do not directly have a mandate from the constitution or legislation. Countries like Mauritius and Namibia. However, these election management bodies, they treat their own mandate to register voters to include civic and voter education through mass media and voter educators. The constitution of the DRC, it does not provide for a clear-cut mandate of the election management body in terms of conducting voter education, but it specifically enjoins political parties to participate in the reinforcement of the national conscience and of the civic education. Here, I will just try to briefly provide a common understanding to civic and voter education. They are organically linked and yet distinct. Civic education specifically, it equips and empowers citizens to participate in the democratic electoral processes with three broad goals. It introduces citizens to the basic rules and institutional features of democratic political system, as well as the knowledge about the democratic rights and practices. It imparts a specific set of values that are essential for democratic citizenship, including political tolerance, trust in the democratic process, and respect for the rule of law. Lastly, it encourages responsible and informed political participation. Whereas voter education is deemed as a subset of civic education, as it specifically focuses on the role of the citizen as a voter. Voter education refers to the information, materials, and programs that are used to inform voters about the voting process for a specific election. It provides details on voter eligibility, voter registration, candidates and parties, how and where to vote, and what is contained in the ballot, and the mechanisms to lodge electoral complaint or dispute. At regional level, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, it also provides some clear-cut provisions which are crucially important in terms of ensuring that election management bodies, they have a mandate to conduct civic and voter education. In Article 2, it requires that member state must promote the establishment of the necessary conditions to foster citizen participation, transparency, access to information, freedom of the press, and accountability in the management of public affairs. Article 12, it requires the integration of civic education in the educational curriculum and the appropriate programs and activities. In Article 8, it requires state parties to adopt legislative and administrative measures to guarantee the rights of women, ethnic minorities, migrants, people with disabilities, refugees, and displaced persons, and other marginalized and vulnerable social groups. The guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, as has been prescribed by the African Human Rights Commission, it links the rights of access to information as provided by Article 9 of the African Charter with the right to public and political participation as stipulated by Article 13 of the Charter. It states that access to information empowers the electorate to be well informed about political processes with due regard to their best interest, to elect political office holders, to participate in decision-making process on the implementation of laws and policies, and to hold public officials accountable for their acts or omission in the execution of their duties. The common approaches and strategies to civic and voter education are often conducted through formal and informal education. The basic and tertiary institutions, for instance, in South Africa, they have also institutionalized civic and voter education. Again, given that persons with disabilities form part of the targeted groups in terms of the receipt of the crucial voter and civic information, you find that there are some materials that are designed to ensure that they are able to have access to that kind of civic and voter education. And they include braille, large font, audio, sign language, and the institutionalization of the universal ballot template, a tactile ballot paper template, and special votes. There are also mass community engagement campaigns with partners and strategic partner initiations and maintenance of discussion platforms. This itself, which deals with community engagement, it's about the physical training sessions, which in most cases are under the current extraordinary legal measures that have been imposed by many governments across Africa. They are impossible to hold. So these common approaches and strategies for civic and voter education includes the multimedia, which relies on print media, television, and radio. The election management bodies can also build permanent local capacity for civic and voter education and pursue in-house and sectoral professionalism and capacity building initiatives. This also includes the expansion staff during heightened electoral activity periods, especially before and during elections. The linkage of civic and voter education with technological systems, it includes the use of the internet as part of multimedia and digital technology, which maximize the reach to the general public and to the electorate. Access to internet facilities and the technological equipment such as computers, laptops, smaller devices such as iPads and small phones become desirable for the purposes of ensuring the efficacy of civic and voter education. For example, Canada has profitably used two strategies to conduct civic and voter education, which are targeted messages and ICT. The use of ICT, particularly social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and SMS, have proven to be a veritable mechanism for engaging citizens and developing their sense of civic duties and political efficacy. They help to promote key civic and voter messages that sensitize the stakeholders to the specific needs of a particular targeted group in the electoral process. The opportunities in terms of using digital or technological systems in order to conduct voter education during the COVID-19 pandemic includes the fact that the right of access to the internet becomes more important, and the accessibility and the usage of digital devices plays an important role in promoting active participation. The election management bodies, they become implicated to digitally continue with the civic and voter education than to desist from promoting civic and voter education, given the fact that the normal physical training sessions are currently not in effect. Government can also collaborate with telecommunication companies to facilitate zero-rated access to certain public information, including government websites, as well as that of state institutions, such as election management bodies. And the relevant websites must contain the civic and voter messages that encourage the intended target groups. The challenges in terms of relying on technological systems to promote civic and voter education include the major threats to promote them through technological system because of the digital divide, which can be defined as the unequal information and communication technology access pattern among populations. The digital divide is divided between the digital haves and the digital have-nots. It exists in both developed and developing countries, affecting ICT users in urban and rural areas, as well as those from different socioeconomic categories. A gap in the ability to use ICTs results in digital literacy and the lack of ICT infrastructure is one of the key contributing factors that might cause election management bodies to be unable to effectively conduct civic and voter education. Some parts of Africa also have difficulties in terms of unequal access to electricity. The research conducted by the Internet World States on the internet usage and population, it provides that 39.3% of the African population has access to the internet. And Africa, among all the continents, it is the one which has the lowest mobile and internet penetration. Another major challenge in terms of using technological systems to promote civic and voter education is authoritarian surveillance technology, where some governments may feel threatened by the powerful influence of social media platforms to the extent that they have occasionally or continuously blocked access in efforts to prevent the information dissemination by citizens or electoral information dissemination of the dissemination of information by citizens on electoral processes. And the cumulative impact on these, it will affect the feasibility of finding digital solutions for empowering targeted voters. On this section, I will provide some brief of the case studies which I have looked on. In preparation of the June 2020 presidential election, the Malawi's Electoral Commission, together with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, produced a series of voter education videos as part of the civic and voter campaign in order to inform voters of the electoral procedures and what must be done in order to ensure that people are voting properly in order to avoid spoiled votes. The video includes sign interpretation, which is crucial for persons with disabilities, information about the Electoral Commission's measures to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus so that the potential voters who could be reluctant to vote out of fear of contracting the virus could be encouraged to go and vote. Among those who registered to vote in the 2020 Malawi presidential elections, it was only 64.81% who turned out for the elections. And the number of spoiled votes was 57,323. In Burundi, there was no clear and reliable information on the digital programs which have been used to conduct civic and voter education. On the election day, the access to social media was cut and no international or regional election observers were present. Among the registered voters, the voter turnout was highly 87.71%. Coming to South Africa, South Africa was set to hold its 96 ward by-elections across 56 municipalities countrywide around March, April, and May. However, due to the threats of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Electoral Commission applied to the Electoral Court for the postponement of the by-elections. The court postponed the elections 3 times before a finalized date, which was supposed to ensure that the backlog of by-elections is cleared. The date was set for the 11th of November, 2020. A 2016 survey of states, which was provided by Statistics South Africa, it indicates that 60% of South Africans have access to the internet, and mainly 70% of them, they live in Gauteng and the Western Cape, which are the two richest provinces in South Africa. And Limpopo, which is the second poorest province in South Africa, has 42% of internet access. In conclusion, reliance on technological systems in the promotion of a consolidated electoral democracy during COVID-19 has emerged as a measure of last resort. However, due to the numerous developmental challenges that Africa still encounters, the feasibility of technological solutions in this instance could be far-fetched. This includes the ability to empower the target groups who are often in need of being encouraged, and therefore the failure to find digital solutions to voter education, it means that they will still not be enticed or encouraged to go and participate in the elections. More ways, voters in rural areas where technological infrastructure and development is distantly slim, they are the hardest people who will face the challenge of receiving voter education. In terms of recommendations, the government must adopt legislation that empowers election management bodies, media regulatory agencies, and other relevant authorities to enforce fair and responsible use of social media during and outside of elections. The government and other relevant stakeholders, such as the private sector, should invest in ICT infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, and provide for cheap internet devices with the view to bring the digital divide in these societies, with a view of bridging the digital divide in these societies and encouraging greater access to social media platforms. And the government must desist from authoritarian surveillance technology that is accompanied by assault on media and internet freedoms, as well as the blockage of access to the internet. Civic society organizations, election management bodies, and other stakeholders involved in civic and voter education activities should prioritize digital literacy in their campaigns to enhance voter participation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. You've continued with the line started by Marystella of being on time. And actually, if we account for the time when you could not yet share your screen, you've done 18 minutes. So comrades, Paul continues with the line started by Marystella around proactivity, proactive governments, and also proactive CSOs and proactive citizens. He advocates for bridging the digital divide, providing digital infrastructure in rural areas, and I would add there also urban areas, high density urban areas where the poor live. He advocates for cheap internet-enabled devices and digital literacy. My question for you, and we'll come back to it, is with regard to the election management body itself, the EMB, and civic education. What does one do when the EMB is itself partisan in handling its civic and voter education responsibilities? What does one do when the EMB offers incomplete education, inappropriate education, or biased education? What's our recourse? What happens when we see, like for instance, what happened in Tanzania, where the EMB refuses to partner with established CSOs or other actors who have the requisite capacity, people who have been doing this before, but then chooses new unknown one-person organizations that have no capacity? What would one do, especially where the law seems to suggest that offering voter education without explicit authorization from the election management body is an offense? But we'll get back to that. I now welcome Kudakwashe Bandama, who will talk to us about rethinking political ideology. This is a case study, establishing a Zimbabwe national project. Welcome, Kuda.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to be helped by Marystella in terms of my slides. Don't know, are you ready, Marystella?
Just give me 1 minute, I put them up.
And we can just get to the slide which says purpose.
Okay.
Maybe I can begin, Don.
I would say so. Just begin, even as she tries to work on the screen. And I can see the screen sharing is coming on anyway. It's come on. Continue.
Yes. We can go to the slide that says purpose. I think it's slide 3. So next, and then purpose. So the thinking around my paper is rooted in looking at the opportunities that COVID has presented. I'm going to be discussing the sub-theme, the effect of the pandemic on political cohesiveness within the electoral establishment. And my topic is rethinking political ideology, establishing a Zimbabwean-centered national project or philosophy. Next slide. The conditions within the Zimbabwean political establishment have seldom encouraged unity, so to speak. But then with COVID-19, it's presented the desire or motivation to have a marriage of convenience within the political landscape, where there is a need somewhat to discount political cleavages and move towards having people at the center. And what I talk about here, I talk about the COVID opportunity. I'm going to attempt to introspect the political landscape and continue to advocate around this idea of establishing a pandemic-centered national project, which maintains and respects political plurality and the majority of political views and ideologies, but have one ideology in which the people of Zimbabwe can identify with as a people when it comes to dealing with issues of a national-centered project, which I will discuss about and link it with elections as we continue. Next slide. The Zimbabwean political landscape is an interesting political landscape, which I think a lot of people are very familiar with. A lot of opinions, objectives, and views have been shared about the Zimbabwean political landscape. But what it is, in essence, is a multi-party democratic system with constitutional provisions which recognize the rights of individuals to form, to join, and to participate in electoral activities of a political party or organization of their choice. And that's in the Constitution under Section 67. But what is more interesting is right now, if you want to talk about the Zimbabwe political landscape, you cannot omit the events of November 2017, where we had what some have called a coup, not a coup, what some have called a government transition facilitated by the military. But nonetheless, there was a transition of power. There was a change, an exchange of hands through the ultimate forced resignation letter by the former head of state. But Adam Taylor of the Washington Post wrote an article where he said that considering that a coup is a negative word and none of the negative connotations perhaps did not dog this event, it's pulled itself having to get such labels as a bloodless correction, which in any manner is described and can be interpreted by the person who says it. But what is noticeable here is November 2017 presented an opportunity for Zimbabwe to give a redirection, to redrive, to have a new direction towards how it's going to progress in the future. In Zimbabwe, we also have the Electoral Commission, which is an institution which is part of your governance framework, which can be said to be a commitment towards having an organized competition within the political spectrum. It can additionally be taken as an effort to develop the democratic space within a country. But in addition to this, looking at the SADC Parliamentary Forum, they add that in as much as you have a multi-party democratic environment, the success of such an environment depends on the commitment of the government and the political parties to move together. So when I'm talking about trying to design a novel political ideology, it is a coming together of all within the political establishment. This coming together must, as I'll reiterate, continue to respect the plurality of political parties. It must continue to respect the multiplicity of views within the political establishment, but it must give birth to an ideology which can be used for national-centered projects, such as elections, as I will highlight further. Within the Zimbabwean political landscape, we then move over to the electoral landscape and ideology. Next slide. When you look at the electoral landscape in Zimbabwe, it has been highly competitive, highly competitive, so to speak. But what this electoral landscape gives influence to is that the political party which manages to win an election is the one which can ideologically direct the nation state of the country. There are scholars who have written, like as you can see on the slides on the screen. One argues that a party's political dominance increases this capacity to ideologically influence. Furthermore, the party needs to stay in power for a very long time. Another scholar suggests that through a protracted tenure, a political party can redesign the political profile of a nation. Another one continues and then says, with the introduction of the MDC in 1999, the lengthy tenure of ZANU-PF as a party was significantly challenged. And with the next slide, please. When you look at now the numbers here on the slide in pie chart format, which look at the 1996 presidential elections, and then we go even into the parliamentary elections and the 2000 elections, 2002 elections. When you look at this pie chart, hello? Don, can I continue?
Yes, please. I'll ask the host to try and check if anybody may have unmuted themselves mistakenly, but continue, please.
Oh, thank you. So when you look at the electoral landscape, as I said before, and how a dominance of the electoral landscape can lead to an ideology being given to the individuals, which they will follow as a nation state. And the dominance of a political landscape is acquired through elections. The practice of having periodic regular elections is one which we have come to establish as a means of being a democratic state. When you look at the charts which are in front of you, as I had said before, you can continue to see that the dominance of the ruling ZANU-PF was in somewhat total effect in 1995 and 1996. And then as you move on forward with the introduction of the MDC in 1999, you can see a significant shift in the 2000 elections. You can see the numbers there with the House of Assembly, and then the 2002 elections also presented a somewhat challenging political environment. And this has been the trend which has continued within the Zimbabwean political landscape, where you have high competition on the part of the ruling party. It's been a very competitive space, but what this shows is, if you look at the tenure of office, if you look at a lengthy tenure of office being a prerequisite of establishing an ideology, it can safely be assumed that within the nation state of Zimbabwe, the dominant political ideology which the people can be said to be given is one which can be pushed, which is pushed by the ruling party. Next slide, please. And now we look at the definition of an ideology. A scholar argues that ideology is a dominant idea which is passed on by a dominant class or within the society. When you look at what has been happening with the electoral performance, it is very easy then to have a cause and effect scenario where you can see that the ideology of the dominant part or class or party can easily become the dominant idea or narrative within a society. And then within a democracy, there are multiple ideological positions that the people are exposed to, but they will respond to that of the party with which they support. Next slide. My next slide is talking about the ideology of the ZANU-PF. The ZANU-PF is a liberation movement, and its ideology, as listed there, is founded on the War of Liberation. A scholar named Moyo, which is not the former professor, former minister, defines the ZANU-PF ideology as a nationalism with an indivisible link to the liberation movement and a strong connection to the army. Another scholar listed there, Ndlovu Kacheni, defines a Zimbabwean ideology and Zimbabwean nationalism as predicated on the assumption that the diversity of ethnic and racial identities has to be homogenized into a singular national identity, and that a successful building of a nation state will culminate in the eradication of diverse identities and projection of an identity of a group that dominates power. What this definition in itself seeks to eliminate any other ideological positions which effectively do not belong to that of the ruling party. And that is not what this presentation seeks to discuss. This presentation seeks to put forward a suggestion that you can have a national ideology which is rooted in a desire to have multiplicity of political views, multiplicity of political identities, but still have an ideology which addresses the political landscape in the social political landscape of the country with the people first. From the ideological position of the ruling party, it can be argued that it does not recognize, or rather there cannot be any other position that the people of Zimbabwe should follow other than that of the ruling party. Next slide. MDC ideology. The MDC has been, I'm using the MDC as a comparative to the ruling party simply based on the electoral competitiveness when you look at the numbers, the outcome, and the support. The MDC ideology, if you look at the manifesto of the MDC in 2013, it describes the party as a socialist party, social democracy, so to speak. And a scholar there highlights that in a social democracy, that ideology demands a high level of cooperation and interaction with a wider global economy. But the key distinction here is when you look at the historical landscape of Zimbabwe, political and historical and social, the wider cooperation with the global community is one which has been accepted to be conducted, but using a certain lens, and it has to come from a certain direction. So the ideology of the MDC and the ideology of the ZANU-PF, in principle and practice, they certainly do not converge, as will be seen in the next slide. This is where we are going to have the bulk of our discussion on the part of the Second Republic. When you look at the Second Republic, which came about as a result of November 17, there were many pronouncements which were made, many political promises which were made. And if I track back a little bit, in the 2008 election, which was highly contested, the former president, late President Robert Mugabe, came out and told the MDC point blank that you can vote for them, but it will be a waste of a vote. I'm telling you that you will be cheating yourself. There is no way we can allow them to rule this country. Never, ever. We have a job to do to protect our heritage. The MDC will not rule this country. It will never happen, ever happen. And that was a bold declaration by the head of state ahead of an electoral competition, which should be a signal of democracy. But there was a bold statement which was said here. And when you move forward now, after in the buildup of the runoff part of the 2008 election, you can see that it was not an empty promise, because the then president of the MDC withdrew from the race, citing that they will not allow themselves to have people lose their lives in bid to have political power. And then they withdrew from the election. And this is the landscape with which we get into the Second Republic from. The Second Republic is led, and the term has been coined by the current administration, which is led by President Emerson Mnangagwa. Upon getting into the Second Republic, the president announced that this is a new dispensation. And in this new dispensation, he promised to lead the country towards a different direction as compared to the decolonizing agenda of his predecessor. And that in this new direction, there should be a truly plural political environment. When you look at such a statement, and if we go back to the beginning of my presentation, where I cited that the Constitution upholds and respects the presence of other political parties, this statement in itself is somewhat of a confession, somewhat of an admission of the lack of plurality within a political landscape. But this is something that the head of state has said that is an idea of his which he wants to follow. In the Second Republic, we've seen diplomatic re-engagement. We saw Zimbabwe featuring at platforms where they had never been in quite some time. But all these things characterize the desire to have a different sort of direction. We saw the formation of PALU, which is the Political Actors Dialogue. This platform is one which was established as a means of having political actors come together in bid to continue to have a development agenda for the country. But the MDC, through its spokesperson, stated that it is a collective position of all sane Zimbabweans that the position taken by Nelson Chamisa, which is to snub such committees at such a time the citizens are suffering. The people are suffering, and this political soliloquy has been going on endlessly with no respite for the lives of the people. It is a self-serving charade with a troop of political non-entities, and Pollard is akin to whistling in a political graveyard. When you look at such a statement being issued by a political party, it's a clear stance as to their ideological position. And if you look at the Political Actors Dialogue being a platform which has been put forward by the president in a way to encourage unity within the political establishment, one can see that there is no way at the present time that the two actors can come together ideologically. But what became interesting is that COVID-19 happened. And it's interesting in the sense that it gave rise to an opportunity to redesign the political landscape, an opportunity to establish new democratic norms. But on the other hand, it was also an opportunity to show and exhibit political dominance of administrative institutions and dominance of the political landscape within the country. So it's a double-edged sword which happened during COVID. But my position then is using the COVID opportunity, they can be the establishment of a novel national ideology, which is rooted in wanting to serve the people. Within Zimbabwe, there was a cyclone which happened, Cyclone Idai, and it affected a particular portion of the country. What this cyclone did was, in as much as it plagued damage towards a section of the country, there are other pockets of the country which presumably till this day would not know that it happened. The difference then between that and COVID is that COVID is something which has affected the country in its entirety, and it's something that cannot be ignored. What this presents is an opportunity to rise to the occasion and use this as a platform where we can actually see another change within the Second Republic. When COVID-19 began, the opening statement of the president in his national address to the people, it cited that there should be unity and that it knows no political party. That was one key phrase which he said, that it knows no political party. Of course, there was the usual rhetoric around what to address and what to denounce. But what was important was that he highlighted that COVID knows no political party. If you look at the initial address of the president of the opposition party, he highlighted that it is more important than politics. So both of these institutions agree and can see that when the nation is plagued by a problem, politics has to be put aside. But what became interesting is after their initial addresses, the rhetoric around their speech began to center around if we were in government, and another one was centering around we as the government are instituting. The rhetoric around having a united front towards combating this problem had simply died down and just became common talk. There are many other events which happened during the time that lockdown started in Zimbabwe up till presently. But what is significant for me was the opening speech by the president of the state and the president of the ruling party, which both of them highlighted the need to discount political cleavages. Both of them highlighted the need to come together to maintain political plurality, but that the people should be put first. What I see as an opportunity, even as I conclude, is that within the COVID pandemic lies an opportunity to establish a national-centered ideology. What this can do when you're looking at national projects such as elections, it effectively can redesign the electoral landscape, the pre-electoral environment, the electoral environment, the post-electoral environment. These are environments within the political circle which are normally marred with a lot of challenges, violent clashes, such that if an election takes place and there aren't these consistent features which we've come to be accustomed to, it appears to be somewhat of a mismatch. We're seeing the same presently happening in the United States, where one party is maintaining its position, the other party is maintaining its position, but both of them happen to exist within a single entity, the United States. And if there is a drive towards having a peaceful coexistence, but vibrant communication, vibrant competition, sorry, it can give rise to a different set of ideological rules and principles, such that even when a party gets into power and perhaps stays for such a long time as highlighted by some scholars, that party has to get into political administration and adopt the position, ideological position of the country, and then have its political ideology as a secondary opinion. What this would do is ensure that in as much as the country can be fragmented with regards to political poles, if you're an individual who simply exists and honors their civic obligation to vote, you will still be having your concerns and views taken care of through a national ideology. You would then not need to have an extreme inclination towards one pole as compared to the other. It would make you more comfortable then to exist as an individual within a political entity and enjoy your political rights, because such an ideology will be there which caters to your needs as an individual. And I think this is the end of my presentation. Somewhat fast, Don, but I hope that the position has been put across that within COVID-19 lies an opportunity to establish a new centered ideology which puts the people first, an ideology rooted in establishing a framework where individuals can exist and coexist without the need or fear to have a political position which inclines towards a certain position. One last takeaway is to dispel a notion which is commonly carried on by many people. It seems to be an accepted narrative that if you don't belong to party A, you belong to party B, without acknowledging that there is a party that doesn't exist, which you probably belong to. Maybe the views within party A and party B are too extreme for you. But what that does is that group of people need to be catered for within a national ideology, an ideology which puts people at the center, development at the center, and that even when you come to national projects such as elections, it becomes very easy for us as Zimbabweans, so to speak, to say we are going to ride towards this ideological position and we want to achieve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objectives. If you look at certain countries, they're driven by sport. Certain countries are driven by their total inclination towards historical political figures. But as a country with a unique history, which continues to play out today, it might be worthwhile to harness the COVID opportunity and establish a national ideology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuda. Accounting also for the technological hits, you also actually kept your 20 minutes, which then has helped us to have at least 32 minutes for interactive discussion with the rest of our participants, noting that our numbers have gone up to 53. So I think those have been 3 very interesting takes, just starting with the last. Paul, Kuda, you have highlighted the dictatorship of the parties and the diminution of the place for independence. We're being told if you're not with A, then automatically you must be with B. What about if you want to be independent of A and B? I think you've also brought out the issue of the ideologies and the strategies of the major political parties in our countries and how these influence the role, influence the soul of the nation, the soul of the country. There are very complex experiences and relationships that we, the people, end up having, especially with one group of these parties, the liberation parties and movements. And to just appreciate that in many of our countries, we still have in power the liberation party that led us to independence, such as in Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania. In others, we have a party that considers itself a liberation party because it liberated us or led us through a transition, usually violent. And you have here Burundi, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda. There are also those with a very complex evolution, but still consider themselves a liberator, like in Egypt. Now, in a lot of these parties, the elite have become self-serving. It's about corruption. It's about eating, but they still keep the revolutionary, the liberation rhetoric. So how do we, the people, have a dialogue with such parties for social transformation? Just looking at some of the comments that have come in or questions that have come in, and I'll start with Marystella and then Marystella and Paul. Marystella, a question that is being asked is, with these internet shutdowns, if citizens and CSOs were to be proactive, what could they do? What does one do? And then there's a question that has come from AFIC, the Africa Freedom of Information Center, that I think is both for Paul as well as Marystella. And that is, should these media companies or digital companies and platforms be regulated in how they provide news and information and how they allow people to express themselves on their platforms? Don't they have obligations, for instance, transparency, accountability on content moderation? If they should be regulated, it's by who and how? What is the role of national governments? What could be the role of regional bodies like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights? And then, Paul, an interesting one for you. Richard Obedi from Uganda notes that civic education writ large is not the role of the election management body. In many countries, it is by law or by the constitution, the role of the National Human Rights Institution, the NHRI. So what can be the interplay between the NHRI and the election management body? Over to you, Marystella, to start. And colleagues, we encourage you to just continue also using the chat box to post questions, comments, share experiences, insights, and so on. Welcome, Marystella.
Thank you, Don. I think I'll start with the one for internet shutdowns and how we can be proactive. As I said, I'm against internet shutdowns to start with. The law has provided that we need, if internet shutdowns means that we are limiting rights, expression, and access to information. If we're going to do this, then we have to ensure it meets the three-part test, right? It has to be legal, it has to serve a legitimate aim, and it has to be like democratic for a democratic society. But we see often that is not it, and as we would like it will be ideal if countries do not shut down the internet, given the fact that we're living in a globalized world. But because this is happening and we have identified countries that are hotspots for this, we have seen Cameroon, we have seen Ethiopia, we have seen Uganda and whatnot. I think citizens just need to be proactively pushing back against this. And I did say about pushing back against this. We say first it's not the law, do we do strategic litigation? It might help, but sometimes we have governments that are a bit hard-headed, even when they receive decisions from courts, they don't follow them. So as stakeholders, we need to be pushing back against this, calling out our governments when they do this. And I think initially when we started this conversation, though it was privately, Dawn, you did mention about how people are actively using VPNs, just having VPNs just in case that happens. This protects you to some extent so that you still have access to information, but it's not always complete that you'll have access to all information, but just proactively having VPNs with you so that you can be able to circumvent if and when your country decides to shut down the internet. But I believe just as stakeholders, we need to be proactively pushing back and engaging with our governments against using internet shutdowns as a way to manage information control by actually highlighting the disadvantages of this, mostly on the economy. And beyond the economy, the fact that it can be counterproductive. If they're trying to avoid protest, it can actually lead to more protest. And I think that is what as stakeholders we can do. You've also talked about the obligations of social media companies. We do know that they have accepted the obligations, though I think sometimes they are more proactive or respond more when it comes to contexts like the US. Because recently we've seen with Trump when he realized, well, he thought he was losing the election and whatnot. We don't know if it has been called or not. It hasn't been called, but when he realized that, he started, he went a bit crazy on Twitter, and Twitter did flag some of his posts. So they do this, they flag to show the information here is disputed and it could not be entirely true. So moving forward, be a bit skeptic when you're dealing with such information. So they do go through this, and they do have to abide by the rules of certain places that they go to, but then still we are dealing with an international company that the capitalistic model will still drive what they're going to do. And we still call for the regulation, and we have laws on this. They still need to abide by the normative framework that we are dealing with. The international law calls for obligations for social media companies and digital technologies, which they have to hold on to, because their products and services do bring with them human rights implications. And with these human rights implications, they can be held accountable. And increasingly, we see countries calling companies like Google, companies like Facebook to account for certain things that are happening in their platforms, which they have not taken action to address, because to some extent, they have a lot of power of what happens in their platforms. And increasingly, and a lot of times, Twitter and Facebook have maintained that they are not arbiters of information, that they are just providing a platform and they're not going to be arbiters of what information is in that platform. But this is sort of removing them in terms of responsibility and what they need to do to ensure that this is a platform that allows for not, well, we express ourselves, but we are also engaging in meaningful debate and just not, just talking in these platforms. But increasingly, we see countries trying to hold Facebook, companies like Facebook and Twitter to account for what happens in their platforms, especially when it leads to human rights violations. And this is an ongoing conversation that even Africa is engaged with, not just in the West. And as stakeholders, I know the center is engaged in this conversation. We need to keep the ball running. And somebody I know in the chat box talked about, yes, we can express ourselves in these platforms, but we can't just go freely express ourselves. And that really touches to what I was saying about misinformation and disinformation. These are threats that are alive in these platforms. And while we realize we have a right to freely express ourselves, we have a right to access information in these platforms, there are limitations to how we do this. In law, for example, you can't defame somebody in these platforms. But again, when it comes to public officials who are usually easily triggered, if I can say that, with certain comments or content on social media platforms and end up using their power to restrict freedom of speech, we have to remember that the law and the UN has spoken about this, that as public officials, you need to have actually a tougher skin than an ordinary citizen when it comes to criticism in the public. And so your go-to action cannot just be shutting down internet or restricting the rights of people. Yes, as ordinary citizens, we have responsibilities in this space to ensure that our actions do not actually infringe on the law or infringe on the rights of other people or break any laws. But then still, however we exercise this, we are not protected from being hurt. That's not what the law does. It's not protecting our feelings from being hurt, but just to ensure that however people exercise their rights, it does not, for example, lead to incitement of violence. It does not lead to defamation of other people, but then still the law does not protect you from hurting yourself. So we have to, there's a careful balance between how we exercise freedom of expression and access to information, but then still within the limitations of the law. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Marystella. In a second, I'll also allow Paul to chime in, and there's a pending question from the African Freedom Information Center. But I've got an interesting thing that has come up in the chat box that I think from Sylvester Kumbuto, that maybe in a second round, I'd be keen to hear what the panelists think, but it's also open to the other participants, everybody else to contribute to, including the chat. Sylvester asks, are we overrating the transformative potential of COVID-19? Can we say that COVID-19, the pandemic, is not a social tsunami enough to change the status quo of our African mindsets as far as elections are concerned? A very interesting question for us all. But Paul, as you chime in, you can also respond to what the Africa Freedom of Information Center said around regulation of media companies and also digital companies and platforms. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Don. Obviously, digital companies cannot just exist in vacuum. There has to be a legal framework which sanitizes their existence and legality. However, there is a need to ensure that the laws do not arbitrarily restrict media companies' rights to freedom of expression. So there has to be that balance that meets perhaps the constitutional basis on what must be done in order for media companies to conduct themselves in a legal manner, and again for the governments not to infringe on digital companies' rights to freedom of expression. And there is a question which you have posed immediately after I've completed the presentation, where you questioned what should be done in order to ensure that election management bodies must be disciplined perhaps when they conduct partisan voter and civic education. I could answer the question as follows. I will first look at the institutional independence of the election management bodies. That refers to the formal legal independence from politics as specified by the electoral law, the laws establishing and governing the election management bodies or the constitution. And this also looks at whether the election management bodies' decisions can be overturned and by whom, as well as the bodies which the election management bodies are accountable for the implementation of their mandate. I can give an example by the Independent Electoral Commission in South Africa. The IEC in South Africa forms part of the Chapter 9 institutions, which are state institutions that are there to support and safeguard constitutional democracy. They have a clear mandate that they need to be independent. They need to conduct their activities, exercise their powers in a partial manner. And the Electoral Commission, together with other state institutions that are there to support the constitutional democracy in South Africa, they are only accountable to the National Assembly, which is one of the two houses in Parliament. Then the Electoral Commissions Act, it has also established the Electoral Court, which provides that the Electoral Court can overturn any decision of the election management body, provided that in case, in relation to the issues which are under discussion now, that you find that the civic and voter education has been found to be non-partisan. It is not impartial, perhaps it favors a particular candidate or political party. Then I guess that given that South Africa has got a very vibrant rule of law and the state and its state of constitutionalism, it really sets a quintessential model in Africa. I guess, you know, the Electoral Commission could be still bound to ensure that it functions within the parameters of the Constitution and the law. There is a question which also relates to the role of human rights bodies collaborating with the election management bodies. The question, it seems like it indicates that the mandate in Uganda is being given to the human rights bodies. I'm not sure if that's true, because if you read section 61 of Uganda's 1996 constitution, which is also applicable and binding right now, that mandate of civic and voter education is charged to the election management body. I guess as part of the stakeholder management and engagement, the Human Rights Commission, as part of the state institutions which are there to also safeguard constitutional democracy in Uganda, they could collaborate. I'm not sure if whether indeed the law in Uganda, it requires the Human Rights Commission to be involved, but I know that specifically the Constitution, in terms of not section but Article 61, that mandate is given to the Electoral Commission. I guess
Thank
I've
you.
answered the question.
I think the point, I think the point, and I'll give Kuda the floor in a second. I think the point that Richard Obedi was making was that yes, the legal and possibly constitutional provisions with regard to voter education are vested in the election management body, but the larger mandate of civic education generally civic education writ large is given to the National Human Rights Institution as well. So I think that's the point that he was making. But be that as it may, maybe he can explain a bit more how he thinks the interplay can affect elections. But then over to you, Kuda, in terms of the question I asked you, but anything else that you see that may have come up. Don't take too long. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I want to particularly address the question by Sylvester saying, are we not overstating the importance of COVID in terms of changing our African mindsets? What COVID has done is it's placed a pause. There's been a deliberate pause on activity. And I think as social scientists, it's very important to deliberate and look at what is happening. Why has the pause happened? In policy, they say every crisis is an opportunity window. You can put policy during a time of crisis. When you look at electoral practices across Africa, it might be puzzling or even interesting to note the different electoral practices that happen over the continent. If you look at the Gambia, when you talk about even voting with marbles, you come to Sierra Leone where you say the electoral outcome by the time the day ends, you would know who your president is because things have to be done that thorough. In the same way that we have various practices within Africa with regards to elections, if an individual was to look across the continent and see the different practices, it might not be shocking that you might want to adopt some and reject others, and that perhaps the ones which you've come to adopt as rule might simply fall away. So when I look at COVID as an opportunity of change, it is indeed an opportunity of change. The counterbalance of COVID is that if you don't have positive change, which drives development, it's going to be an opportunity for negative change, which is going to instill permanent policies or rules or norms, which are not going to lead to development. In terms of redefining an ideological position, COVID-19 presents that opportunity. You can get to actually sit down and introspect what your party's manifesto is, what the counterparty's manifesto is. Does your party have a manifesto? You might even get to stop and look at your representatives. They represent you. Have you seen your elected leaders? What is happening within the political spectrum? COVID-19 has brought a deliberate pause on anything which we thought was normal. I mean, we're having a conference virtually. Without COVID, all of us would be sitting in a static space and perhaps even engaging more robustly outside the screen. But at the same time, because of having a virtual conference, a participant can carefully type out their question, which they more or less would have been shy or embarrassed to cite in a static conference. So there's opportunities in both scenarios. What needs to happen is to harness the right opportunities within this small window. Because now with people wanting to go back to a normal atmosphere, things are going to change. Some practices are going to be lost, but what is important is how we harness the current opportunity to introspect ideologically, to introspect in terms of practices. So I think that COVID is not an overstated opportunity, but an opportunity in itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a good point you've made. And I'm encouraging, everybody else to also really think about what has changed and what hasn't. Speaking with some friends of mine about part of what has changed, but it's actually returned to the past, was the point made by people that over a lot of Africa, handshakes, shaking hands as a form of greeting was not our norm. That's something that was inherited, actually imported in by the colonial power. That in lots of African communities, how people would greet would be by breaking the kola nut or by clapping hands at each other and so on. So it kind of maybe means that these people had evolved mechanisms out of previous epidemics and pandemics that regulated their behavior, and that they're just being made now to remember that which they were before, rather than really coming up with something new. So something has changed, but it seems that part of what is changing is a return to the past. Just in order to get clarity from Richard Obedi, who made the point around the roles of the National Human Rights Institution, as well as the roles of the election management body, I'd like to invite you, Richard, to speak to that a bit more in a second, and maybe also just tell us about your hopes, aspirations, and fears about the upcoming elections in your country. It's one of the next ones, early next year. So maybe you unmute yourself and put on your video so we can see you. But ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just go back to that theme of proactive citizens and to encourage us in the next few comments. We've got about 11 minutes. That until we find a different way of selecting those who govern us, elections will be the way. We have African standards, and the presenters have spoken to them, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The regional economic communities have protocols or guidelines. SADC does, ECOWAS too does. So what does a proactive citizen do to guarantee, elections that are, to the extent possible, on a level playing ground, that are free and fair, that are accurate, that are credible? I'll give the example of Kenya, and say that in the run-up to our August 2017 elections, the ones that produced the first annulment ever of a presidential election declaration in Africa, CSOs and active litigants had filed close to 20 cases before the elections in the 12 to 18 months preceding the elections. So any lacuna in how the constitution was to be interpreted was probably litigated. Any indication of unfair action by the electoral management body was litigated to get the courts, especially the Constitutional and Human Rights Division of the High Court, to issue orders to the electoral management body and to other actors that they must operate within the four confines of the law. They must be transparent. There must be fair administrative action. So what does this tell us of what we can do in advance of elections on issues such as internet shutdowns, on issues such as accreditation of observers and civic and voter education providers, on issues of fair administrative action? So with that, I invite you, if you're ready, Richard, maybe you explain a bit more so that we can go back to our three panelists.
Yes, hello, are you getting me?
Yes, we are. Go right ahead.
Yes, thank you, Don. Thank you for the elaborate presentations made by the respective presenters, and thank for your wonderful and excellent moderation. Now, yeah, I think the response made by Paul Mudua, if that's the correct name, yeah, he gave that attempt because we, as an organization, we hit a snag when we went to Electoral Commission to get accreditation, sometimes about a month ago. And it was them who told us that, well, you cannot do civic education because that is outside the mandate of the Electoral Commission. So then I asked, okay, what happens then? Said, no, you need to seek that mandate from Uganda Human Rights Commission, which of course is an entity that has been established by an act of parliament, in the same vein like the Electoral Commission, which is also established by an act of parliament, and section 12G, 12(1)G and I of the Electoral Commission Act gives the mandate to them to accredit any organization, especially the civil society organization, to do that supplementary role of conducting voter education. But anything to do with civic education is outside their mandate. And they've clearly made that to us. So we again wrote to the Secretary, Uganda Human Rights Commission, and I think hopefully we shall pick the letter this afternoon or tomorrow morning for us to be able to conduct civic education in regards to the 2021 general election. That is, the process has actually started by the nomination 2-3 days ago. I mean, a day or two ago, and then campaigns will begin next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And now we are down to our last 7 minutes. And I'd like us to take the very last minute between 2 minutes to the hour and the hour for all of us to collectively switch on our videos so that our organizers can take one group photo of all of us for remembrance sake, what we call in Swahili kumbukumbu. So that will happen 2 minutes to the hour. Right now, I'd like to invite each of the three panelists to just take maximum 2 minutes each to give their final word. And as for the rest of us, still on the theme of proactive citizens, we can continue, making comments, giving ideas, or even just questions on that. How can we be more proactive around elections? So I'm going to invite now, in the order in which they spoke, Marystella, then Paul, then Kudau, to give us their final words in 2 minutes. Welcome, Marystella.
Thank you, Don. I think I reiterate what just you said finally about being a proactive citizen. We have now realized we understand the politics of our country just with the internet, with the media, with all this information that we have. We understand the politics of our country, even if you live under a rock or something, unless you live under a rock or something, we all understand the politics of our countries and what challenges have been faced by our country. We might be phased or swayed by our ethnicity, nationalities, and those things in society that divide us, but we all understand at least something of what is happening. And to be proactive, we need information. And that is why we still now champion for access to information, and not just information, but credible, accurate information at a timely time. So as citizens, we need to proactively seek this information and realize that our inclinations might make us biased. And to avoid being stuck in echo chambers, we should also proactively look for information that counters our belief, so that we are not just looking at one side of the coin, but we are looking at both sides of it. And while we can say, yes, because of this, I have these insights about something that affects the democracy of our country, we look at the other side. So we need to shatter these echo chambers that we are in. And to do so, we need to have accurate, timely, and relevant information. And that's what I'll push for at this time. Thank you, Don.
Thank you very much, Marystella. And Paul?
Thank you, Don. I'd just like to say that the advent of COVID-19 has in fact exposed us to so many things that we were capable of achieving. For instance, now we are holding a virtual conference across the entire African continent, trying to diverse some strategies on how we can continue with holding effective, inclusive, participatory elections, including ensuring that voters are informed to actively participate in the elections. So COVID-19 did not only come with far-reaching implications, but it has also opened some opportunities for us in order to engage. With regards to the election management bodies, I think it's high time that, given that there is a continued impact of the COVID-19, they must just try to ensure that they really adopt technological systems to ensure that potential voters are informed on what must be done in order to actively participate in the elections. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now over to you, Kuda.
Thanks, Don. I think in closing, I would say, riding on from what Marystella said, we need to shatter echo chambers. And at the same time, we need to think different. We really need to think different as a continent, as a people. We need to establish new norms of democracy, new norms of participation, and new norms of engagement. And I really think that if we are able to continue to harness numerical advantage of the youth, that has to be continuously mentioned. And that if there are a demographic divide that begins to think different, we can bring about effective change. I mean, it's a tragedy really that we need to actually come up and say we need to devise a new way of electing our leaders. And as a continent, I believe that solutions are within us. We need to think different. Thanks, Don.
Thank you very much to our three presenters. I won't even try to paraphrase what you said. I'll just, as I asked before, request each of us to just switch on our videos so that group photos can be taken. And I'll just conclude on the point of proactivity that we've discussed today. We've shared ideas, examples of what other countries have done. We haven't spoken enough about what our colleagues in Malawi did that gave them a free and fair election in difficult circumstances, but that was discussed yesterday. So I started by acknowledging the proactive academic institution that has brought us together, the Center for Human Rights. I'll continue with what a proactive NHRI can do, regardless of what Richard Obedi said. The example in Kenya was that a proactive national human rights institution took on the role of investigating and calling for the stopping of electoral violence, especially state-sanctioned electoral violence, immediately the results were announced, the contested results. So whereas NHRIs may not have a primary role in election, at least that's one area they can look at, electoral violence. We've given the example of using litigation and other strategies in advance of the election, the 12 months, the 18 months before the election. A final one is after the election, many of us get so tired after the results are announced, or maybe like in the case of Kenya, or in the case of Sierra Leone, or in the case of Zimbabwe, you do a presidential election petition and the result, the decision is given. We don't go back to audit deeply about how the election was run and ensure accountability for those that messed us up, even if that accountability takes 2 or 3 years to come by. if we actually get people jailed for stealing our election, it will be the strongest deterrent for the next set of electoral officials to be a bit more clear with their job. So with that, I would say, let's think about that, and we can discuss it in the afternoon or in other sessions. I hand over back to the organizers to close us down, lead us to a 1-hour break and to the afternoon session. Thank you. Marystella, was somebody going to take the final word and then tell us how we break and meet again in an hour, I believe?
Yes, so the next session is going to be at 1400 hours, that is South African time. And that should be, I think, 1300 hours West African time and 1500 hours East African time. 3 p.m. East Africa, 2 p.m. South Africa, and 1 p.m. West Africa. Thank you very much. I believe this was a very insightful session. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the presentations from my co-panelists. I enjoyed your moderation very much, Deya. Thank you so much for always being a partner of the center, and we'll definitely be calling you again because this partnership is one for life. And we thank all the participants who've been with us throughout from morning until now. We are hoping we won't lose you in the, in the afternoon session. We're hoping you'll still be here. We'll be looking a lot around media technology elections, and Uganda is taking the spot here because their 2021 elections are coming up, and very interesting things have been happening if you've been following the developments in Uganda. And so we are hoping to see you in the afternoon. We just want to take the short, just a few minutes to do the picture. I'm hoping Yolanda will guide us on this, or Simpiwe, and then we can take the picture, go have our lunch, and come back in 1 hour. Thank you very much again to everyone.
Hello, everyone. If you can maybe just switch on your videos, your cameras, just for a short while, if you want to be in the picture, it would be very nice. Thank you. And then we can take a screenshot and we'll let you know when we are done. Thank you very much. One down, one more to go. If you can just bear with me, please. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much, and hope to see you after lunch. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you at lunch, after lunch.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Later on.